Cool, thank you. All right, I think it's still morning time, right? 11:30-ish, something like that. I'm still on Pacific Coast time from the States, so I'm getting up at all sorts of weird hours and feeling like a zombie first thing in the morning when it's the middle of the night for me back on the Pacific Coast. So if I lose my train of thought or ramble, just call out and throw rocks or stones or something like that at me. Have we got any developers in the audience by any chance? Oh, that's too many. Hold on. Who put their first up hands up first? There you go. I've got a couple of books to give away for questions and so forth. Anybody else? It's on 2013 development that just came out by myself and a couple of other folks, and so have fun reading. It'll definitely put you to sleep if you have problems. But thanks to everybody for coming along this morning. My name's Chris Johnson, and today we're going to talk a little bit about intranets and how you can build them and make them more interesting and functional using metadata and search and some of the new features in SharePoint 2013. So to give you a little bit of an overview about myself, my contact details are here. You can see I talk funny. I'm a Kiwi, but now I live on the west coast of the States. You can contact me at loungeflyz or Z on Twitter, and I blog at looselytype.net. I used to be a Microsoftie for 10 years or so, and then about a year ago, just over a year and a half, left Microsoft where I was on the SharePoint team for a while to go and start a consulting practice for a small systems integrator on the west coast of the States in Bellevue, in fact. So today, the way I thought we'd approach this is just to go through a little bit of history about intranets and some of the techniques folks have used in the past for building intranets, building search-driven intranets, building browser hierarchical based intranets, some of the options that you have available to yourselves, how SharePoint 2013 sort of changes the game with what's available out of the box to help drive these things. And then we'll go through some techniques of pulling some of these features together in 2013 to drive and build some interesting experiences. So basically at the end of the session, I'd like you to be able to leave and crack open a 2013 site with a whole bunch of documents and content and that sort of thing, and being able to build search-based experiences across the top of that using the new capabilities in 2013. And then also just to leave with a sort of a thought around that hierarchically based or hierarchically structured intranets are not the only way to do these sorts of things. And now we have some of these new features available. But first I want to go back a little bit in time and talk about kind of how intranets started out and how we got to the point we got to today, or where we're at today. So intranets way back used to just be basic pages of links. There were documents strewn across the enterprise or organization. There were all sorts of resources available through the browser or in different repositories around organizations and so forth. And so it really started out like an index of a book. And you ended up with pretty rudimentary pages with a whole bunch of links to these different things. And it very quickly sort of became quite unmanageable with so much going on in an organization that it had to be structured in a little better than just straightforward lists of links and things like that. Then came the self-service revolution, where intranets started actually doing something rather than just being sort of a read-only resource of finding something out in the organization, to being able to do something. And so you might be, you see the little drop-down of I want to fill in a leave request, or I want to fill in an expense claim, or something like that. And so they started sort of evolving very slowly. And very quickly, people needed to add code and that sort of thing to their intranets to build this custom functionality. But back then it was very custom. Everything was one-off and you had to write a lot of code, and there weren't that many products to help you. So back then, I don't know about your guys' experience, but mine was building intranets using ASP before ASP.NET over SQL Server, and building all the functionality from scratch. Not necessarily every time, but there was a lot of code involved. We came up with some patterns and practices and some reusable components, but for the most part it was custom code from the ground up. We were doing things like creating a page in the intranet and being able to edit it in sort of a semi-WYSIWYG way, and then tagging it with content by being able to pick from sets of terms and so forth, and then using SQL to query over all of those pages in a database to pull back the relevant ones based on those tags for the particular section of the intranet that we were in, or the browser was in, I should say. And so it was very, you can see where it's going, right? This is how intranets have evolved, and this has become a lot easier, and you don't have to write that custom code to do these sorts of things. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, and how to do that in 2013. Hands up, anybody who worked with Content Management Server 2002, 2001, a couple of hands. So for those who haven't heard of CMS 2002, it was an acquisition from a company called Encompass, just up the road from the Redmond campus in Vancouver in Canada. And it had some concepts that were quite useful for intranets, things called connected pages, which were the ability to create a page of content or a piece of content and surface it in multiple places in the intranet. So for example, or I should say the website, we were using it a lot for building intranets as well as internet sites. So you could create a page in your content repository, say like an HR manual or a form or something along those lines, and then sort of tag it and say, I want it to surface in this particular place in my intranet and this particular place. And this is one of the things we've really struggled with in SharePoint for quite a while, is how do I create content and author content in one place and surface it in multiple places? And we didn't have a really good solution for that for quite some time, since having connected pages in CMS 2002. And now in 2013, we've got some new functionality to help do those sorts of things. So I'd sort of summarize our options for building intranets in three really simple ways. You either build them for people to browse, which is some sort of hierarchy, and in SharePoint 2010, that would be a site structure with a single site collection and a bunch of sites below it, maybe like a site for each division or team or what have you. And that's really easy to browse, right? You get the nice navigation and you can click down through the hierarchy to find the site that you're interested in and then the content that you're interested in. But you need to know where to browse to. You need to know that a particular project or team site is in a particular place in the hierarchy if you're going to browse for it. So it's got some drawbacks there too. The second option is search-based, which is, you type in a term and get some results back, or you start driving the content in a search-based fashion so that you're sort of browsing, but behind the scenes it's doing searches for you. And that's really powerful because it means you can surface content in multiple places, even though it exists once, by the use of tagging and so forth. But the flip side of that is, just a search box is kind of difficult to use if you don't index your content correctly, or if you're, the results that person is interested in come up at the top. So it also has some interesting drawbacks. And then the hybrid option is one we'll talk a little bit later, which is this concept of mashing the two together to give a browsable but also searchable or search-driven intranet experience, which I think is quite powerful. So the browse versus search dilemma has existed for quite a while, right? This is the dilemma everybody has building an intranet, where you either go, or you can do both, but either go browse a hierarchy and expect people to know where to go, or sort of on the right-hand side, provide a experience similar to what they're used to on the internet. Everybody uses Bing, right? And give them a list of results. And so each have their pros and cons, as I suggested. But there's so much data in an organization now, more so than has ever been, that building just a browse experience is no longer really that good. The content is so broad and deep that knowing where to go to find content gets really, really tricky when you're talking about millions of pieces of content and so forth. So we need a better solution than just browse. The pros of browse is that it's really easy to implement. This is the way SharePoint has done it for pretty much since the dawn of time. Most people create an intranet site. It's got some templates in there. You go and customize them and put your own look and feel in them. But at the end of the day, typically I see a lot of intranets being, or the main part of an intranet being a single site collection with a big root site with a whole bunch of subsites and subsites and subsites, and very quickly your site collection gets enormous. It's really tough to manage. Content's being authored in sites and subsites, which makes the content really hard to manage. Then you start seeing storage problems because your intranet starts getting so large and people are sticking documents into those subsites, and suddenly you can't manage your single site collection in a database that is easy to manage, backup, and supportable, and so forth. So it has some pretty big drawbacks in that regard. And people have tried over time to sort of separate things out and sort of fudge the navigational structure so that you kind of split your intranet over multiple site collections. But at the end of the day, they're all kind of a little bit hacky and don't work all that well. People see the URLs changing. It's not a nice structured URL system that they'd really like to see, and things like that. But it is super easy to do. So back in 2003, 7, and 2010 days, pretty much your information architecture almost reflected the hierarchy of your intranet, right? Like I said, most people have a homepage that kind of gives them the news and the weather and all of that sort of rubbish. And then they have different divisional sites and so forth. And then they might have teams below that. Projects usually split off somewhere separate just for management reasons. But I have seen intranets where they just create project sites as subsites, and suddenly you've got a couple of thousand of those and a few hundred gigabytes of content, and then all hell breaks loose. So the problem and the drawback with this is that content lives in the site hierarchy typically. So when I want that HR manual published, I go stick it in the HR site. And if I want to stick it somewhere else, maybe on the homepage of the intranet or somewhere else, I have to go copy it there or put a link to it in that HR site. But it's not a great way to surface it in multiple places through the use of like tagging and search and so forth. And then search is, search is separate. So by that I mean, although this is browse-based, typically it's augmented with a search style function, as you'd expect. You know, a single text box, type in some terms and get some results back like you would on the internet. But the two sort of experiences are quite disjoint, and the user has to make a conscious decision. Am I going to go and try and find what I want through the browse system of your intranet, or do I want to go and kind of fingers crossed and hold my breath that search is going to work well? Or you have to really heavily invest in your search system and make sure you've got really solid best bets, really good relevancy, and that's usually dictated by people tagging content correctly and appropriate metadata on content, which we all know, you know, when you get that little box when you check in a document and it gives you all of those options, you're like, check in. So it's sort of a crap in, crap out experience. And so a lot of search systems, you don't get very good results from them because nobody's putting in the effort up front. So search, you know, is pretty fast and familiar for folks. They're used to it, using it off the internet and so forth. It's quite powerful if you get it right, but it's a lot of effort up front, right? They've got to, as I say, tag all the content correctly, or you've got to have some sort of workflow or process that's helping users do that. You've got quite a lot of tough decisions to make about what metadata, for example, is standard on a document, designing all your content types correctly and that sort of thing to make sure that search really pays off. And as I sort of said, it's rubbish in, rubbish out, right? If you don't fill stuff in correctly, you're not going to get a good experience for search. And it's a little bit hard if you don't know exactly what you want, right? If you're browsing, you can sort of, oh, I think it might be over here, and I might noodle down a little further and go find something. But search, you have to be very specific. It's literally asking for 1 or 2 or 3 words, and you've got to know exactly what you're looking for to get good relevancy out of it. So sort of the question is can we mash browsing and searching together to give a better experience for folks finding things on your intranet? And I think the answer is yes. In the past, as I mentioned, folks have been doing this in previous versions of SharePoint, but it's been quite difficult. And often it's resulted in custom scenarios or custom code to do it. So for example, I have a couple of examples on intranets that I've worked on that we can talk about in a second. But some folks put content into SharePoint, will tag it and so forth, and then maybe they have some sort of workflow or event receiver that looks at that content, grabs the content, looks at its tags, and builds up some sort of custom tag repository that they can then later go and query for a set of results. So for example, you could be throwing documents in your intranet and tagging them with certain things. And because they're spread across lots of different sites in the organization, and you want to surface it in your intranet in a nice cohesive way, they'll take that content, they might get the title and the URL to the document and the tags that are associated with it, and put them in some sort of custom tag repository like a SQL database or a list in SharePoint. I mean, I've seen it all. And then go query it with something like the content by query web part to pull content out in a nice, sort of list view or custom styled view on the homepage of the intranet or say on the HR site. And they kind of use that as a way to aggregate content from a lot of different sites because there wasn't a really nice, easy way to do that out of the box that was performant and straightforward to implement. So folks, as I said, used content by query to go get that data out of SharePoint, for example, or they'd write their own custom web part, for example, to go get that stuff from SQL if that's what they were using. Or even sort of the more sophisticated folks, if they got it right, were using the search system. They'd write a custom web part or a piece of code to go and call the SharePoint search index and say, I want content that's tagged with HR. And that was a little more difficult to implement. You had to get your search just right. You had to be indexing everything perfectly. Your relevancy had to be really good. And it was a little bit of a shot in the dark whether it was going to work correctly every time. So it was a bit hard to control. So to give you an example of an intranet that I worked on a long time back, this is an intranet for a customer of ours from years ago. And they decided they want to do, it was quite revolutionary at the time. The intranet won a Nielsen, I think top 10 intranets in the world award or something along those lines. And it was completely search and metadata driven. There was no real browse capability. Everywhere you'd go, you'd sort of see boxes like this which showed little counts of content in the particular sections that you could drill into. And when you drilled into a section, it would just give you results based off that. And so it was a search-driven system. But unfortunately, to drive it, you had to fill in a ton of information. And so I'm sure you've all seen this where intranets go pear-shaped. But this is the check-in experience for a document. And they had so many different sort of metadata fields you had to fill out that they had to have somebody dedicated to make sure people were filling this stuff in correctly, filling it in correctly, not incorrectly, and making sure it was all correct so that it would show up in the correct spots. But the good bit about it was that you could pick multiple different metadata fields and fill them in so that the same content showed up, say, under finance, but also under IT. And so you'd have one piece of content then being able to be surfaced in multiple locations. And that was quite, I guess, groundbreaking for SharePoint in the time because all of the guidance and most of what people were doing with intranets was that hierarchy-based content structure for a browse-first experience. So that was kind of that was something that was happening. I think this was about 8 years ago, maybe between 5 and 8 years ago, somewhere around that. And it was on SharePoint 2007, I believe. So what in 2013 can help us build these better sort of search-based experiences that folks can use to browse and search? So I looked up on, I saw this on TechNet the other day and I thought this was interesting. Most people, and most of what TechNet talks about and MSDN talk about when they give you documentation for 2013, they mostly talk about publishing sites being public-facing websites. And who was in the talk just before this with Waldeck? Is anybody? A few hands? Yep. So most of what Microsoft talks about in the documentation when it comes to publishing sites is about delivering public experiences for folks on the internet and building, rich content-rich websites. And I saw this and I was thinking, wow, the world's changing a little bit because in this document I sort of read the summary here and it said internet, intranet, and extranet, and I was like, wow, that's a nice change because normally it used to just say internet for publishing sites. But this stuff is really applicable in both scenarios. So a lot of what you've heard, if you went to Waldeck's session or went to any other sessions on WCM at this conference or others, when folks mostly talk about publishing sites and those WCM features, they're pretty much all 100% leverageable when you're building an intranet. And so when I talk about WCM to folks, you have to clarify whether you're talking about public-facing internet or intranet. I mean, they're same, but pretty different. But so the point is, many of the features in 2013 are applicable in both scenarios. So things like, the content targeting pieces, taxonomy improvements, those sorts of things are all applicable in both scenarios. So what are some of the things that can help us in 2013 with building these, richer search-based intranets? So I just picked a few of the sort of WCA Mesh features that I think help in 2013. Things like cross-site publishing that allow you to surface content in multiple places from one publishing point. The cataloging system, content by search is something we're going to dig into in a demo or two in a moment. But this is a really powerful new out-of-the-box web part that is a real step up from what we had to do with content by query. We'll get into a little bit of the differences and details in a minute. Managed navigation, so being able to build your nav structure of your site and manage your nav structure of your site from metadata or taxonomy in SharePoint and the flexibility that gives you. That's another huge win for intranets. Continuous crawl, so hands up anybody that doesn't know about continuous crawl. Anybody? So basically, just a quick summary is that lets you get stuff into your search index much quicker. Search is continuously running, and it can be a matter of minutes versus hours before stuff shows up in search. So it's kind of like doing incremental crawl constantly. Faceted navigation for being able to, for being able to refine as you navigate, and also recommendations. I think these are all features that are applicable to intranets that a lot of folks will only talk about in an internet scenario. Cross-site publishing is really interesting because it kind of goes back to that original point I made about Content Management Server 2002 and the feature that I've dearly missed with connected pages or postings, some people call them postings, from that product. And that when CMS 2002 got rolled into SharePoint, that was one of the things that didn't come with it. And that's been a real stumbling block for some customers. And in fact, I've worked with customers even in the last year that are still looking to migrate off Content Management Server 2002, even to this day, I should say, because they haven't been able to move because of connected pages. Even some Microsoft properties, some of the websites that Microsoft run have only until very recently run on Content Management Server 2002, which is kind of freaky when you think about it. So cross-site publishing aims to fill the gap of connected postings effectively. So if you're familiar with that, this feature will really, really help. In a nutshell, it gives you the ability to author your content in one place, search indexes it, and then you have multiple publishing locations or places you want to surface that content either on your internet site or on your intranet, be able to surface it like it existed in those sites. So this is really useful also in the scenario where you want to publish stuff or you have things on your intranet and you want search to index it and maybe you want to surface it on your internet site, your intranet site, and maybe an extranet as well, if you've got them all connected up to the same search system. So it's pretty interesting from that perspective of being able to author stuff in one spot and surface it in multiple locations. So what? Well, the authoring and publishing in one spot gives you quite a level of control that we didn't have before. So for example, in the past when somebody was building an internet or an intranet site and they wanted a page, sort of a web page, you fill out the content and hit save, and then they wanted that to show up in another location on their internet site, for example, they would have to go copy the page, or they'd have some workflow that tried to help automate that and copy it across into another location, and hopefully it survived the travel and that sort of thing. But it got quite cumbersome to manage because suddenly you've got multiple copies, Then you've got to figure out what happens when I change the source copy, how do the destinations get updated. Similar kind of, if you're familiar with the way variations work in SharePoint, it's a similar kind of problem that variations aims to solve for multiple language scenarios. So being able to author it in one spot gives you that single point, single source of the truth, I should say. It also means that you can do all the standard stuff in SharePoint, like secure your content, structure it, and the process around updating that content in one spot rather than trying to manage that spider web of proliferation through your site. It also means that you don't necessarily have to author stuff in your intranet itself. So say if I wanted to create that HR manual we spoke about earlier, I could do that in my HR site where I'm working with the rest of my team with the same security and processes in place and that sort of thing, but still have it published to the main intranet site, and I don't have to do some sort of manual copy or update a link or do something along those lines. So it's very convenient in that respect. And so you can obviously display it in another place, but it doesn't have to be the same place either. It doesn't have to be that site. It doesn't have to be the intranet. It could be some other internet site, for example. And you can also obviously bubble it up in search. So what I want to do now is just flip over to my demo environment. And I'm going to show you an example of just adding a content by search part to an intranet and some of the configuration options you've got for that and how it's driven off taxonomy and documents and so forth in another place. So let me flip over. Oops, no, I don't have two machines. All right. Huh. Let me just find. Aha. Oh, I'm going to have some resolution weirdness. Okay. And I can't see my screen here. This is going to be tricky. All right, bear with me while I look like a spanner and try to do this. Okay, so I've got my Insert Amazing Intranet site here. And the first thing I want to do is just show you a really rudimentary example of content being in one place. In this case, it's going to be some documents being tagged from a taxonomy that I've defined, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then adding content by search to a subsite and being driven by tags to show content from our search index. So over here in another site, in my IT site, which is a separate, I don't know if you can see that up there, but sites WAC IT, so it's a separate site collection. So it's not within the same site collection that my intranet site is going to be in. I've got some documents here, and you can't really see it on the right-hand side. I've got a column here called Department, and this is a managed metadata field. So if I go in and take a look at the prospectus document and go edit properties here, I've got some tags that I've applied. One of my tags is now missing. It's the little red dots. But in here you can see I've got, this field is tied to a particular part of our taxonomy. And in this case, I've just created one, a term set called intranet. I was feeling very creative at the time. And added some tags for different parts of the intranet, different departments. I guess I should have called it really department, would have made more sense. So I've gone through and tagged some of our content with those. So we can see here we've got these documents. This guy down here is IT sales and marketing. Most of them are IT. And this one's got extra sales tag on it. And now if we flip back to our Insert Amazing Intranet site here, what I'm going to do is just create a new subsite that we're going to put some content in. Let's call this IT Web. So this is going to add a new subsite into our intranet. Working. There we go. So I've got an out-of-the-box team site here with no content on it. Let's go in and edit this page. And what I want to do is, because this is going to be the IT section of our intranet, I want to go put the documents that I've indexed on the IT on the IT page. So first I'm going to get rid of the very helpful WYSI button thing and replace it, just put a content by search web part in there. So you find this up on the Insert tab, web part, and it's under content roll-up. So that kind of makes sense once you find it, but I was thinking, oh, it's probably under search or search-driven content. Not so much. It's under content roll-up. Content search is the one you want. And click add. All right, so now we've got a blank content search web part and we need to jump in there and configure it. So you come in and say edit web part. And then you basically go through this query building experience of saying, I want to query my search index. This kind of feels weird. Gotta stand up. You've got to build your query over the stuff that comes out of your search index. And you do that, you get a whole bunch of options. You don't have to write any code for the simple scenarios. And you can also, if you were in Waldeck session, you can also see how to do this by sticking code directly in page layouts and so forth as well. This is the kind of the web part based experience. So you can click change query, and this will bring up the dialog that lets you configure your content by search web part. Over on the right-hand side, you get to see a very handy results preview, so you can see the content that you've currently got selected. You have some different tabs up the top for the different settings and so forth. But this main page contains probably the most important parameters that you need to provide. So in this case, what we're going to do is say, I would like to pick documents from not just the current site, but don't restrict results by any application. And so that basically means don't just get stuff from the site collection you're in, but anywhere on the, in the search index will do. And so you can see we've started to get some search results coming up here, and you can see things like engineering principles and deblurring images for continents. And so those are coming back from our search index. Question?
Chris, can you add non-SharePoint sites to the search and then bring those back as well? So, for example, if you just had file shares or...
Yeah, definitely.
Or
yeah.
Other SharePoint searches.
So the question was, can other stuff from not just SharePoint pop up in here? And absolutely yes. So you can index things like other sites in your organization and so forth. You just have to make sure that when they're indexed by search, they're tagged in an appropriate way that you can go get them back in a convenient manner with querying, for example.
Could you attach the metadata schema that you have if the elements in these other areas so if you put something into the metadata schema and the URI points to the location elsewhere,
yeah, so
they'll tie together.
So you're saying you want to, when you go and index that stuff, can you index it and tag it with terms from your term store
if you
on the way in?
In your metadata schema database,
yep.
Could you point to those items already so when it pulls back a document, it knows the metadata from a database as well? And then, or is that a bit?
I think we'll have to clarify.
Okay,
yeah, can we chat about it at the end and go into it a bit more detail? Yeah. I've seen folks do a similar kind of thing where they'll either augment it with a list that adds all of the tagging for particular URLs or particular sites and index that, or customize their search pipeline to do custom tagging on the way in. There's a bunch of different options for that. So we've got 8 results coming up over here on the right-hand side. And so we've gone through the first 2 parameters. The third parameter is restrict it by a particular tag. So the default option is don't restrict it by any tag. So this will just pull up all documents based on this query so far. And what we want to do is just refine that a little further to say, I want to restrict it by a particular tag. And in my case, I want to say, I want it to be tagged with intranet or IT from our intranet term set. So I can click on that, and you'll see our result set changes a little bit. We're down to 7 results. I click OK. I'm just going to change the look and feel a little bit of that web part results using the display template. I like the 2-line option for documents. Uh-oh, now I've got scroll bar hell. And click OK. And we're starting to get some documents come through. Only 3 pop up because one of the settings in the web part was how many to restrict it to. I could have cranked that up if I'd wanted. And let's just go save this page. So now we're starting to get these documents from a different site collection surfacing inside our IT page. Now this is obviously an out-of-the-box page with no custom styling on the web part at all. But I'll show you some examples. I've got some screenshots of examples of you can style this to your heart's content using these display templates and format these in any way you want. You could do thumbnail previews from the search index, for example. You can add additional properties. You could do the description, all sorts of metadata properties back from the index you can surface in here. I've just used an out-of-the-box template, a very rudimentary example. So let me just jump back and show you those examples. Oops. Started again, huh? Let me just skip forward. Okay, so this is a sample intranet that we're working on where, for ourselves, in fact, that uses content by search for a couple of really interesting scenarios. One is we have site collections for every customer that we work with and site collections for every project that we work with. Everything's all quite separate and not very hierarchical. And so what we're using is we go and index all those site collections, and one of the pages in that site collection is the home page per project or per client. And the page layout that we use in every one of those, for the home page in every one of those site collections, is based off a particular content type. And on that content type, we have some standard properties where we add the customer's name, any tags from our taxonomy about that customer, and a whole bunch of other metadata properties about the projects, for example. Now, the reason that's important is because when we go and index it, that particular page is indexed, and that content type is sort of marked in the search index. And then what we do on our intranet is this thing in the green box here is a content by search web part, and we're limiting it to a particular content type, which is the homepage of all of those sites. And we're able to aggregate a list of all of our customers and projects, and we're able to pull custom metadata for those customers out, like a short description about the customer and things like that. So we use that for, in this case, it's clients. We also use it for things like news. So we have offices in Auckland, Wellington, Manila, Singapore, and Seattle. And we all have different, repositories for where our project sites live, so they're nice and close to us. But what that means is that the news that we publish to, say, the Seattle homepage, we want to bubble up to our main intranet. And so we index it, and again, in the same way, we have a custom content type for news articles. We go and index all of those, and we use things like the content by search. In this case, it's styled a little differently, and we can roll up and bubble up news articles from across all of our different sites, and not limited to site collection. So it's nice and quick because it's all driven off the search index. We're not using content by query, so it doesn't have to go through and run a custom query every time. It's really snappy based off search. And then we can also add things to this, like refinement panels and so forth, if we want to get really snazzy.
I have a question. How do you handle permissioning in the sense that, for example, you don't want IT people to publish it in the HR area?
Yeah, so the question was, how do we deal with security, and how do you make it so that HR people can't add stuff to the IT homepage? There's a few ways to tackle that. Obviously, securing content and access to those sites is sort of that base level foundation that doesn't go away in any of this. And search is obviously indexes security properties so that stuff that people shouldn't see won't show up. So that's the first sort of first gate you've got to get through. The second is around the actual publishing itself. There's a couple of ways you can tackle that. You can have a workflow process that's sort of an approval step for people in the HR site to be able to say, oh yes, I'm cool with this content now bubbling up and showing on the homepage. And that's probably the most common way to do it. and so there's a custom approval workflow that happens when somebody publishes some content that has to run first. But there's a couple of ways to tackle that. Either you do it before the content gets published or after the content gets published, depending on the customer. Some don't mind it showing up and then having a get rid of this button beside it so that whoever's looking after the HR site can say, oh, that's not relevant. I'll axe it from the index and get rid of it. So it really depends on the scenario. So in this case, it's bubbling up news. Now the interesting thing is, it's nice because it doesn't really matter what sort of content it is. In our case, we use it for clients, projects, and news items from across all of our different sites and different site collections on different farms, all aggregated and indexed with one search system. We can show it wherever we want. We don't have a big performance hit because we're going straight to the search index for the content. And we don't have really weird sort of roll-up problems across site collections and so forth. So we're doing it for things like events as well. And it's applicable in quite a few scenarios there. This is an example of the projects. There's a refinement panel on the right-hand side that lets us refine the search results that come back. So we could say just projects of this particular type, maybe just intranet projects or custom development projects or public-facing internet sites or whatever, and come back and see projects that are just relevant to that. Okay, so that's content by search. Managed navigation. So this is the second feature I really want to highlight that most people will think about for internet scenarios, but I believe is really powerful for intranet scenarios. And this is really moving away from that concept of a structured, hierarchically structured intranet with sites below sites below sites, and moving to a very flat structure and using search and managed nav to make it look like a browse, sort of a hierarchy-based browse experience to the user, whereas underneath the covers it's really not. So when this happens, we flip our site to use a term set for its structure rather than the site collection hierarchy that you usually get out of the box with SharePoint. You get some other nice features that people often moan about with SharePoint 2010 and before, with not getting very friendly URLs for sites and not being able to fiddle with the URLs for sites. So I don't know if you know, but once you create a site, you can change the display name, but you can't fiddle with the URL easily. If you're using a publishing site, you get the whack pages thing. Then you've got to do some crufty, horrible code to get rid of the pages out of the URL, and it's all very unsupported and heinous. So managed nav gives you a better way to deal with nice, friendly URLs. You can define, you can change, and you can make them look really, really, really nice. And the other thing is there's no site hierarchy underneath necessarily. So let's take a look at managed nav and how that works. Oh yeah, over there.
Can't you duplicate the space?
Yeah, I could duplicate, I guess. Let me try. Ta-da, perfect. Book for that guy, whoever that was. You got one already? All right. Okay, so in this example, what we're going to do is I've got a different site here called Metadata Intranet. And as you can see, the nav here is, I've got some departments already created. But what I've done is gone through and configured this site and flipped it from the standard nav system to a metadata-driven nav system. And the way you do that, there's a couple of important steps. You've got to go into site features. So you've got to turn on publishing for your site collection, and then you've also got to turn on publishing in your site collection features. So you want SharePoint Server Publishing before the nav section of your site collection will show up. Otherwise you just get the out-of-the-box options. So let me jump back now into the navigation section under look and feel. And you get a couple of options. You could say display the same nav as the parent site. By default, structural nav is the, sorry? Was there, I was wondering if I was doing something wrong. No? All right, cool. Structural nav is the default option that you get, and I've flipped it to managed nav for both the global navigation on the site and the current. So current is what you get down the left, global is along the top. So both are flipped to the managed nav. And when you do that, you get a new section in this page down the bottom, which lets you pick a term set or create a term set to structure your navigation off. So in this case, I've just picked my intranet nav term set, which has those, those departments in it. And so now those show up at the top of my site, and our nav is driven off those. Now, the interesting bit here is what happens when you click on those. So let me flip over to, where do I want to go? Term store. And take a look at that term set. So if we look in intranet, there's a couple of things that are really important in here that you need to do to flip to manage nav. You need to go into intended use and make sure that use this term set for site navigation is ticked. And that will mean that it shows up in that picker and that it's available for use in nav. And the other thing I've done is tagged it, set it to available for tagging so that I can also tag those documents. Then over on term-driven pages, this is where you get to set what pages are launched when they click that link on the intranet, so by default. So if I set a particular page here and tick this box, then when they click that item, it'll take them to the page I specify in here. Now the reason why you'd want to set this is because it's the default for everything below it in the term set. You get the ability to override these when you dig into a particular term. So let's take a look at one of the ones I've done already. Let's take a look at IT. So I've got available for tagging here. I've got some navigation settings, so I can set the particular name of what shows up. I can also go and set the pages that get launched or the user gets directed to when they click that item in the nav. So here I get to customize my friendly URL. So if I wanted to call this IT web or foobar or whatever I wanted, I could fiddle with the with the URL structure there. And then down below it, where I get to set these pages, these are overriding the parent's settings in the term set. And so you can do this per term if you like, or you can use the same landing page for a bunch of terms. And we'll talk about using one page for a bunch of different sections in a second so that you get different content. So that's how the term set is set up. Now, you don't have to do all of this yourself. Once you've marked it for use in navigation, then SharePoint will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So if we take a look at that site again and go to the home page here, say I wanted to add a new section to my intranet, I could just come in and create a new page. Whoops, I hit the wrong button. Just jump back. Create a new page. Let's call this marketing and click create. And what SharePoint is doing in the background for us, because we've flipped to using managed nav as our system, and I've also set it to create terms in that term set when I create new sections. So if we now take a look in the term store, just refresh that page a bit and jump back into our intranet term set, we should see marketing now showing up in there. And so SharePoint's gone and added that for us. We can go start tagging documents if we like with that. We don't have to go and manually create it. And then if we jump in there and jump to the term-driven pages section, you'll see that it's already got those URLs all set up for us. We don't have to go and manually set this stuff. But we could come in and say that I want to customize the URL if I wanted to something different. So now we've got our marketing page. What we're going to do is go put a content by search web part back on there again. We're going to do something a little different this time. So we've got our default web part. Let's go edit that again and set the query for it. Now, when I mentioned you can have the same I call them landing pages. Some people would call them, home pages for a section or whatever. I call them landing pages. When you go and want to create a landing page for multiple sections, you obviously don't necessarily want the same content on each of those landing pages. You want it customized to the site that you're viewing it in. So for HR, you might want HR documents, whereas IT, you want IT documents, and marketing, you want marketing documents. And so instead of just restricting it based on a particular tag and typing in, marketing in here, what we could do is come in and say restrict by navigation term of current page. And so what that does is when you navigate to the marketing section using the managed nav, and you've got marketing in the URL, that is pulled from the term store, and so it's a tag. And this web part then picks up that tag is in use, and you can use it to dynamically query and filter your results. So now that we're in the marketing section and I pick this option, it'll pick up that we're in the marketing section and we'll drive this query a little differently. I'm not sure if I've got anything tagged with marketing because that's a new term, but I'll jump into another site and show you in a second what that looks like. So let's just click OK. See if any results pop up. I have to go index, tag some content, and then index it again. I don't have continuous crawl set up. So let's just jump into the IT section, or let's jump into sales actually. I think I set this one up earlier. Go back into the config for that web part. Flip to restrict tag based on current term, and you can see we've got a couple of documents showing up. So if I click OK there and exit out, now it'll be pulling it from that nav system rather than a hard-coded term in the query. And so what you can obviously use that for is build, or what we use them for is building standard landing pages for different sections with different web parts and so forth that are dynamically driven based on the terms that that person has come in with. The user doesn't know, right? They just navigate to a particular section of the intranet. It looks hierarchical, they're still in browse mode, but behind the scenes we're leveraging the power of search and the taxonomy to drive the content experience, but the user doesn't necessarily know about any of that stuff. So we can publish these pages and you can reuse them in different sections if you like. Okie doke. So let's jump back to here. Ta-da. Right, I'm back at the start again. Gotta love PowerPoint today. Hold on. All right, so just in summary on that, the important pieces are obviously setting up your term set for nav. You can either do that in the global management pages for your term store, or you can do it when you go and flip your site to use managed nav and you've got create term set button. It'll go create a term set and you can start adding your hierarchy there. You can fiddle around with the URLs and make sure they're all nice and clean, and define your landing pages or category pages for landing on. And then obviously making sure that the content to drive those pages is tagged and indexed appropriately. So just taking a look at our options again, we talked a little bit about browse and a hierarchy-based structure that pretty much everybody is familiar with doing in SharePoint today. We talked a little bit about search and using some of the managed nav and search-based systems for driving content dynamically. But what about if we kind of mash the two scenarios together? How does that help? So if you think about, we looked at the hierarchical option plus search gives you quite a powerful experience, and what it really means is that you can drive a hierarchy-based intranet with content that you author and store in each of those subsites if you want, and augment it with different project sites or content from different site collections elsewhere in the organization. So this is interesting because from a management perspective and governance perspective, managing site collections and things like that, you don't necessarily want to end up with one massive big database and so forth, so you want to separate your content easily, but this gives you a nice way to still get some of the benefits of a hierarchy-based system. So for example, being able to secure and author content ingest this subsite to a set of people. Being able to store some information in these subsites could be quite useful. Or you might be moving from an intranet or already have an intranet that's built in this manner that you just want to add some new features to. And so being able to add some search-driven content from projects. So for that example I talked about with the My Projects web part being driven from search, this is kind of exactly what we're doing. We're saying all of our project site collections have metadata in them. We've indexed them all, and then say in our IT page we can say here are our IT projects. And it gives us a nice quick way to do cross-site collection queries. So the pros of it is that it's really easy to augment your existing site. You can add content by search web parts. You can go through and rip out all those content by query web parts that you've invested in and replace them with search and get some perf gains from that. It's a little easier to wrap your brain around. So most people think about site structure in a hierarchy-based manner. And when you start talking about these sort of amorphous search-driven single pages that drive different parts of your website and so forth, some people have a little bit of a hard time wrapping their brain around that. It gives you the ability to do distributed publishing, and by that I mean you can augment the site structure-based publishing system with adding content from other sites pretty straightforwardly without a ton of work. And it means that you can not end up with one massive site collection and deal with however you want to structure your team sites or project sites or whatever types of sites you have from a storage management and governance perspective completely separately and help bubble that content up. Some of the cons are that makes it more complicated in that now you've got content in different parts of your intranet coming from different site collections and so forth. So that makes it a little bit more complex to manage permissions across all of those things and stuff like that. And you still have a potentially large site structure in your main intranet if you keep publishing more and more content into that, and you can end up with the same problems that you had anyway. But it's a nice, I think it's a nice compromise between the two, between the browse and purely search-driven experiences. Some considerations for all of these search-driven experiences that you're going to have to think about pretty heavily are your search crawling strategy. So a lot of people just turn on search and let it index stuff, and then they wonder why their search experience is pretty crappy. So there's some things that you've got to make sure that that you think about when you move to a scenario like this. Your crawling strategy is going to be really key for freshness of data. So if you're only crawling once a week or once a day or something like that, and you go add a really business critical announcement or something, you've got to make sure that your crawling strategy is in place so that it pops up within a timely manner, because it is coming from the index and content won't get in there until it's been refreshed. And so I'd definitely recommend investigating continuous crawl in 2013 to assist with that. And that should get you through some of the freshness problems. It's still, continuous crawl is not instantaneous. It does take some time to get content in there, but it's more instantaneous than incremental or full crawls. Obviously, the whole thing is driven off tagging and metadata, so you've got to have a really solid tagging and tagging system in place so that you can not burden the users with tagging too much and not, I did a project for a customer where they wanted 35 compulsory fields on every document, and they insisted, and it went ahead, and they wondered why nobody tagged anything, or everybody just started sticking stuff on their desktop instead of putting it into SharePoint because it was just way too hard. So it's definitely worth making sure you have a solid tagging system in place before you start tackling any of this. Obviously, if you've got tons and tons of older content, you're going to need to think about what you do with that and how you deal with that. There are some third-party tools that can help with this stuff and look at big bodies of content and then do automated indexing on that content and in a very clever way look inside a document and say, what's this document about, and tag and apply metadata for you, which might get you sort of 80% of the way there. So that's something also to consider if you've got a big body of content you're not quite sure what to do with. Often that happens with file system migrations where you've got tons of folders and files and no tagging and only content that's in document properties or content inside the documents. and you want to bring that into SharePoint, and as part of the migration, do some automated tagging and so forth as you move it in. So in summary, I would definitely consider search as being I would urge you to consider search as being a very important part of driving an intranet experience going forward. Users are obviously used to browsing intranets, but as your content grows in size and you end up with millions and millions of bits of content in your organization, driving your intranet from a search-based solution is obviously going to give you far more power and ease of use in the long term when you're dealing with larger content repositories. It's critical to go do your taxonomy and metadata work first before you start tackling any of this, because obviously search can only be driven by things that are tagged correctly. Rather than just dropping your whole hierarchy-based intranet now, think of some simple scenarios where, say, bubbling up lists of projects or news articles or something along those lines by simply adding content by search in different locations could help. And leave it hierarchy-based for the moment and start adding and augmenting some search-based experiences in there, rather than necessarily having to drop and rebuild your whole intranet using content by search and managed nav, for example. Some other related sessions that I saw on the list that I think would be really interesting. We only sort of looked at 2 features out of that list that I gave you. We looked at content by search and managed nav, obviously. But Waldeck looked into a whole bunch of other features in the session just before this. So on the DVDs that I believe everybody will be getting or have access to, you can get the videos of these sessions if they've already happened in the past. So I think Waldeck's and the Order Out of Chaos with Managed Nav are 2 sessions that I'd definitely take a look at. And then there's a dev session as well for looking at how you can leverage managed nav and tagging and so forth using custom code solutions that Miriam will be doing. So with that, I'd just like to wrap up and say thank you for all attending. I'm happy to take questions at the end, but I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference, and not to mention the party tonight, which will be one definitely not to miss. Thanks very much.